October 1944, over 30 SAS soldiers were trapped behind enemy lines in eastern France. Against all the rules of war, many of them were tortured by the Nazis, brutally executed and thrown into mass graves. In the same area, 4 special operations agents, captured while undercover, suffered an horrific death, injected with carbolic acid by a Nazi doctor. SAS Major Bill Barkworth was the brilliant intelligence officer dispatched after the war to find out what had happened to the missing soldiers. He and his team would track down the Nazi murderers wherever they were hiding, among the millions of POWs and bombed-out remains of post-war Germany.
Revenge didn't come into it as far as we was concerned. We had a job to do, and that was to bring these people to justice.
When a second Nazi hunter, Vera Atkins, came looking for her girls from Special Operations, Barkworth helped her track down the evil doctor who had murdered them. In August 1944, 2 months after the Allies had stormed the Normandy beaches, they were pushing the German army deeper and deeper back into France. American General George S. Patton's highly mobile Third Army was giving the Germans a dose of their own blitzkrieg tactics. There was even talk of the war being over by Christmas. The Germans were expected to make a stand along the wooded ridge of the Vosges Mountains, the last natural barrier before the River Rhine. To disrupt the German defenses, Allied commanders decided to send in the SAS. Living up to their motto, "Who dares wins," the Special Air Service had gained a deadly reputation in the deserts of North Africa. Their highly trained mobile teams caused havoc behind enemy lines. Just what was needed in the Vosges Mountains in August 1944. The plan was to involve nearly 100 SAS for 2 to 3 weeks. Stage 1 was to send in a small team with supplies and ammunition for the local French resistance. On the night of August the 12th, this advance party were on their way to the drop zone. Their mission was to link up with the French partisans and establish a base camp ready for the main SAS force. One of the French volunteers on the ground was a young lorry driver, Henri Poisson.
C'était quelque chose d'inimaginable. Parce qu'on ne s'attend jamais, on pensait bien un parachutage. Mais quand on était dans l'action, eh bien, on a ressenti comme une espèce d'angoisse parce qu'on n'avait jamais connu ça à notre époque. Et puis, ma foi, l'ambiance et puis l'enthousiasme dans un fond de l'ensemble de nous autres, eh bien, on s'est tout de suite engagé à collaborer et puis à faire son devoir.
At first, the densely wooded slopes of the Vosges seemed to offer ideal cover for SAS-style hit-and-run attacks. But as the advance party searched for a base, they had no idea they were now the target of a ruthless manhunt led by Dr. Erich Isselhorst. Isselhorst had been a Gestapo officer since 1935. He had been trained to track down and eliminate enemies of the Nazi regime. He had commanded one of the notorious Einsatzgruppen on the Eastern Front. They were Hitler's killer squads, sent into the newly occupied territories to slaughter tens of thousands of civilians. Isselhorst was now head of the security police on the French-German border. His orders? To wipe out any French partisans and SAS parachutists. The operation was named Waldfest, or Party in the Forest. At his disposal were security police, regular army, and special Gestapo task forces. His men were expert at extracting information from their captives through interrogation and torture. One of his most brutal Gestapo commanders was Dr. Hans Dietrich Ernst. He had recently sent 800 French Jews to their deaths in Auschwitz. The main base for Operation Waldfest was Schirmeck Security Camp, only 15 miles from the SAS drop zone. The SAS soon found themselves in firefights, as they kept constantly on the move, using the dense forest as cover. Their allies in the French resistance were very enthusiastic, but suffered from lack of training. Within a week, many of them had been killed or captured. On the 17th of August, the SAS lost their first man when a sergeant went missing. No one knew if he was dead or alive. Vastly outnumbered, the advance party found themselves up against an enemy far more ruthless than they had anticipated. Sergeant Len Owens was a radio operator attached to the SAS.
I knew the lads in the patrol that went, and they said they were given information that on the ground it was only lightly occupied, and that there were second-class troops, which was absolute rubbish. The area was snoring with German troops, first-quality troops.
With the advance party struggling to establish a safe base, Colonel Brian Franks, the operation commander, had to wait 3 weeks before parachuting in with the first men from the main SAS force. In a deadly game of cat and mouse, Franks kept his men moving from camp to camp to avoid Dr. Isselhorst's killer squads. Small teams of SAS were dispatched to ambush German transports, but they were soon running into difficulty. One four-man patrol failed to return, and 3 more new arrivals went missing at their drop zone. No one knew what happened to them. And further trouble was brewing on the main front to the west.
Caravans of supply trucks, the famed Red Ball Express, barrel across France. Many of the trucks carry ammunition and precious fuel for Patton's advancing tanks. But Allied supplies are dwindling all along the front, and finally even the Red Ball Express runs dry. Patton's surging army must stop dead in its tracks, unable to follow and finish off the retreating Germans.
The halting of General Patton's advance was a disaster for the SAS. It meant they could be cut off behind enemy lines for weeks. The Germans took advantage of Patton's delay to divert even more troops, including armored units, to hunt down the parachutists.
We had expected to be relieved by General Patton's Third Army in about 10 days to a fortnight. And we were in fact really left marooned. And it was from then on that the whole operation went wrong.
already 10 men down, Colonel Franks was still trying to find a safe drop zone to bring in a further 60 troops. He had to keep one step ahead of the German manhunt.
They had Alsatians, and we could hear these dogs barking in the distance. A quick exit was indicated.
When another 3-man patrol failed to return from a mission, Colonel Franks decided to move east to a densely wooded valley near the village of Mousset. One of his senior commanders, Major Andy Waitley-Smith, had to be left behind to look after a wounded officer unable to make the journey. A local couple hid them in a cave in the woods. But not every local could be trusted. After taking refuge in this house, another 8 SAS fell victim to a collaborator who tipped off Isselhorst's men. After a desperate 4-hour firefight, their ammunition ran out. As they tried to escape, they were captured one by one. By now, Colonel Franks had lost touch with 21 men. Morale was sinking fast. But then, a series of daring parachute drops onto this meadow, within a few hundred meters of Mousset, brought in the remaining 60 men and their highly prized jeeps. Equipped with twin-barreled Vickers K guns and Browning machine guns, these jeeps were the SAS trademark. They were soon ambushing German convoys along the main routes through the mountains. But after more than a month hiding out from Isselhorst's men, provisions were running low. The SAS turned increasingly to local villages for supplies. Ordinary people like Madeleine Patry took extraordinary risks.
Ils venaient tous les soirs à une telle heure et ils suivaient un petit ruisseau pour ne pas se perdre parce qu'il fallait attendre la nuit parce qu'on avait les boches qui étaient là, au château. Alors, on les mouillait, hein. Un jour, ils étaient là à la porte et je les avais à la maison. Croyez-moi que je ne savais pas quoi en faire. Alors, j'ai dit à mon père, je les ai mis dans la porcherie avec un porc qui était là, et les 2 Anglais. Si bien qu'ils en ont laissé tomber la mitraillette dans la soupe. Ça a toujours été un sourire. Mais enfin, c'est une réalité.
But there was soon very little to laugh about. Dr. Hans Dietrich Ernst, Isselhorst's brutal commando leader, was about to unleash an horrific campaign of reprisals. On the morning of the 24th of September, all the men at Mousset, aged between 16 and 60, were rounded up in the center of the village. Watching from the forest, the SAS were unable to intervene. The local men were marched to the nearby chateau. Despite vicious interrogation, no one betrayed the SAS. The punishment was deportation to concentration camps including Auschwitz and Dachau. In total, nearly 1,000 men were deported from the towns and villages around Mousset. By early October, the American advance from the west was still held up. Colonel Franks' SAS operation had lasted 11 weeks, and he decided he couldn't keep his men in the forests any longer. It would mean abandoning Major Whately Smith and his fellow officer hiding in their mountain refuge, and several men still out on patrol. So Franks left a rearguard team to wait for the missing men. Then he gathered the rest of his troops at this clearing in the forest. Dividing them up into small teams, he ordered them to head west, through enemy lines to join up with the Americans.
We were unable to continue with the operation effectively. Mind, it was a relief to realise that we were going to get out, because all we did was chase from one place to another.
But their comrades in the rearguard never made it back to the American lines. Out of the 100 men under Colonel Franks's command, 32 SAS and 1 signaller were listed as either captured or missing in action. He would have to wait until after the war to find out if they had fallen into the hands of Dr. Isselhorst's Gestapo killers. Then in May 1945, news came from the French authorities. They had discovered the site of a mass execution near Gaggenau in Germany, just over the border from the Vosges Mountains. Some of the bodies were British. If they were Colonel Franks' missing SAS, this was the first indication a terrible war crime might have been committed. Within a week, Franks dispatched Major Bill Barkworth, a brilliant, if unorthodox, intelligence officer, to lead an SAS investigation team. Barkworth was the ideal choice. Fluent in German and good at French, he relished the role of military detective. Arriving in Gaggenau, he began the gruesome task of trying to identify SAS soldiers among the 27 British, American, and French corpses found at the bottom of a bomb crater. They had clearly been murdered, shot in the head. Dog tags identified both Major Whately Smith and the wounded officer he had been looking after. 3 other SAS personnel were also identified from dental records and wristwatches. Barkworth now commandeered this private house in Gaggenau as a base for his investigation team. The large basement would make an ideal temporary prison for Nazi suspects. The hunt for the murderers began with a trawl through detailed Gestapo files, which had been captured when France was liberated the year before. From them, Barkworth was able to trace the exact movements of Isselhorst's Gestapo commandos operating in the area. Men like Dr. Ernst, who the SAS already suspected of an earlier atrocity against some of their men. It was soon clear that many of Barkworth's former comrades had been interrogated and tortured at Schirmeck Camp, run by Dr. Isselhorst's Gestapo henchmen. Within weeks, his camp commandant, Karl Buck, was tracked down, as well as a number of French ex-prisoners. They revealed that several British soldiers had been badly beaten up and tortured at the camp. A grim story was now emerging. In late November 1944, Dr. Isselhorst ordered Buck to execute his SAS prisoners. But the Americans were about to overrun his camp at Schirmeck. So Buck decided to send his prisoners hurriedly east across the German border to another camp near Gaggenau. On November the 25th, the SAS officers, along with captured American pilots and some French civilians, were taken out to the edge of the bomb crater and shot. The man who actually pulled the trigger was SS officer Heinrich Neuschwanger. He proved easy to track down. By August 1945, he was in SAS hands. Dusty Rhodes, one of Barkworth's team, remembers taking Neuschwanger back to the scene of his crime.
Our officer commanding, Major Bill Barkworth, was speaking to him and asked him what was his feelings about the murders that had taken place now that the war was practically finished. And he just stood there and in a very arrogant sort of way that he didn't seem to have any feelings whatsoever. And when he then turned and looked at me and I looked at him, and then thinking about the people that you knew personally, that's when my temper went. So I just, yes, I did lose my temper and I knocked him to the bottom of the bomb crater into about 18-inch of water that was in the bottom. But he was fortunate because he was coming out. I mean, the people that had gone in there before wasn't coming out.
Barkworth's men were making progress. One of the Nazi criminals was in custody, and he knew 5 out of the missing 32 soldiers had been murdered. But then came devastating news from Colonel Franks in Britain. Faced with the massive cost of rebuilding their bomb-shattered cities, the government was planning cuts in the armed forces. The SAS regiment itself was to be disbanded. The whole investigation would have to be called off. Desperate to find funding to keep his war crimes team in Germany, Colonel Franks turned to Jürgen Galitzin, an intelligence officer working for the War Office.
He said, I'm going to ask you a very big favor. And he said, I've been told to demobilize the regiment. Is there any means you can keep this team going? So I said, well, leave it to us and we'll do what we can. And in fact, quite without any permission at all, merely because after the war there was quite a lot of obviously administrative confusion, one managed to keep the momentum going.
Galitzin arranged for Barkworth to receive secret funding from London, and he set up a radio link with the Nazi hunters so that he could help them assemble their evidence of war crimes. Meanwhile, Barkworth still had 27 SAS and 1 signalman to account for. Now he could investigate a tip-off that several SAS bodies were buried in the village of Mousset, across the border in France. In the village graveyard, the local priest had buried 8 SAS soldiers and a missing signalman. 3 had been killed in action. Witnesses revealed that the other 6 had definitely been murdered by the Nazis. Barkworth was shown the exact spot where Privates Brown and Lewis were shot and their bodies burned. The farmer's wife in the house opposite had been ordered to close her shutters, but she saw the German executioners at work. The body of the signalman Sergeant Davis had been found in the woods. He also had been shot at close range, probably after refusing to reveal the location of the SAS camp. And finally, the 3 men Fitzpatrick, Conway, and Elliot, who had lost contact with their comrades at their drop zone. They too had been captured and executed by another Gestapo commando working for Dr. Isselhorst. Barkworth was now even more determined to hunt down the Nazis responsible. Out of the original 32 SAS on his list, he now knew 10 had been murdered, just 3 killed in action. The fate of the remaining 19 was still a mystery. He knew that at this house near Mousset, 8 had been betrayed by a collaborator, and taken away by the Gestapo. He had also discovered that 8 of the rearguard team left behind by Colonel Franks had taken refuge in this farmhouse on the outskirts of Mousset, staying here until mid-October. Despite the risks, they were looked after by the family of Yvonne Malaisé.
Ils étaient affamés, ils avaient des conserves dans leur sac à dos, ils les ont données à mon père qui les a enterrés devant son atelier. Et après, on leur a donné à manger ils ont mangé au moins 8 ou 15 jours avec nous. Un beau jour, ils sont partis. Ils sont revenus 8 ou 15 jours après, je ne pourrais plus dire aujourd'hui exactement. Ils ont demandé qu'on leur redonne leurs conserves. Mon père a donc recherché ça, puis on leur a donné encore un peu de nourriture. Et puis ils sont partis, on ne les a plus revus.
Barkworth's investigations revealed that the 8 SAS men had been captured by a German armoured unit. They had then been handed over to Dr. Ernst and his notorious Gestapo task force. But no one knew what had happened to them. That left just 3 more SAS to account for. One of them, Lieutenant James Silly, had been killed during a mass execution of French partisans deep in the forest. To hide their crime, the Nazis had thrown their victims into this former sawmill and set it alight. Amongst the ruins, local people later found the broken glasses of Lieutenant Silly. For the 2 remaining SAS, Barkworth established they'd been captured by the Gestapo, but their bodies were never found. Barkworth now had definite evidence of 11 murders committed by Isselhorst's men, and good reason to suspect that another 18 may well have suffered the same fate. It was time to bring their Nazi killers to justice. The search took him and his team into the massive prisoner of war camps and detention centers of post-war Germany. With millions of refugees trying to make their way home, it was like finding a needle in a haystack. The situation was made worse for Barkworth's investigators because Germany was now divided into different zones, run by the British, the Americans, the French, and the Russians. Each zone had its own rules and regulations, but Barkworth's refusal to observe them made him a lot of enemies.
I think they regarded him as being very unorthodox and not prepared to give the proper respect due either to rank or system, so that whenever possible, obstacles were put in his way. The British zone, you had absolutely antipathy, and definitely, if he were, at one stage, he was actually forbidden to operate in the British zone.
But Barkworth's men would not be stopped even when they discovered one of their suspects was actually working for the Americans in their legal department.
We had a photograph of him, saw him coming along the street. There and then arrested him and put him in the jeep and took him and put him in prison in Strasbourg, in Karlsruhe. From that one, the American forces were looking all over for this warrant officer Rhodes that had arrested one of their personnel. I did manage to get about a month's leave out of that, actually. I was quickly put out the way for a short period of time.
On another occasion, Barkworth made a phone call, impersonating a former Nazi to get his man.
He said to this Gestapo man, "I'm onto a frightfully good thing on the black market. If you meet me under the clock in Cologne on such and such a day at midnight, or, I'll cut you in on it and we can share the proceeds together." And this fella fell for it, and the SAS team were waiting in the shadows, and they got the prisoner.
Though Ernst and Isselhorst still remained elusive, several of their subordinates were soon in Barkworth's hands. Their confessions confirmed that his worst fears had been correct. The 8 men betrayed at this house had been taken to the Nazi camp at Schirmeck and interrogated. A fortnight later, they were driven into the woods to be executed by members of Ernst's Gestapo force. Under SAS interrogation, the captured Nazis also revealed another atrocity against the 8 men from the rear guard party left behind by Colonel Franks. They had been driven up through this forest into this remote lane where there was a small embankment. A shallow grave had been dug. One of the Germans, who was called Geiger, had been posted at the top of the lane as a guard to stop anyone coming down. The SAS troops were then forced to remove all their clothing, and one by one they were brought to the top of the embankment and shot. Barkworth's men needed the evidence to prove this story. They scoured the woods looking for a shallow grave in an area of about 1/4 of a square mile.
We'd searched every square inch if it had come to that. Finally, I, being an horticulturist in my own profession, decided that a certain area of growth was slightly different to the rest of the habitat in the surrounding area. And my first attempt at digging, I came up with a chap's toe. And knew then that we found the 8 missing SAS personnel.
As Barkworth's team built up their case against the Nazi war criminals, the hunt for evidence led them to more gruesome discoveries. Up in the hills above the Gestapo's camp at Schirmeck, the Nazis had been running a secret concentration camp called Natzweiler. Among its victims were Jews, members of the French resistance, and British undercover agents. Barkworth's investigations at Natzweiler had caught the attention of a fellow Nazi hunter, Vera Atkins, of the Special Operations Executive. She was looking for her own agents, missing in action in the same part of France. The Special Operations Executive had been set up by Winston Churchill with a mission to set Europe ablaze. Men and women agents were carefully selected for their ability to operate undercover. Then they went through an intensive training program, turning them into expert saboteurs. Their aim was to create networks of resistance to harass and disrupt the German forces. But the risks were high. 120 of the SOE agents dropped secretly into occupied France did not return at the end of the war. Vera Atkins had trained many of the women.
Having been involved with their going to the field, it is essential to trace them to the very end, to know what's happened. And for the sake of the families, no one will ever believe that someone who is very dear to them, in fact, is dead, unless some proof can be provided.
Top of her list were 4 agents who she discovered had been captured by the Germans and sent to a concentration camp in eastern France in early July 1944.
André Borel the first woman to be dropped in occupied France. Diana Rowden, slim, tall, a little Scottish ribbon in her hair. Vera Lee, smaller, roundish face. Sonia Olshansky was a very able and very much admired and a very brave and effective girl.
Their final destination had been Natzweiler, the desolate Nazi death camp very close to the area where Bill Barkworth's SAS comrades had been murdered. When Vera Atkins heard that he had begun to interrogate former workers at the camp, she set out to join his team at their base in Germany. She brought with her vital eyewitness evidence about the fate of her girls from Brian Stonehouse, an SOE agent who had just returned from years as a prisoner of war. He had been at Natzweiler in early July 1944, and he recalled the unusual arrival of 4 women. As a gifted artist, he had a good eye for detail.
I was digging this trench in Natzweiler in the early afternoon, and some SS guards and 4 women, young women, walked down the center of the camp to the bottom of the camp. So I stopped and I saw these 4 women. And I remember this one who was carrying a fur coat. And we thought, well, what on earth are these women doing here?
The story was confirmed by another inmate at Natzweiler, Albert Geries. He'd run an escape network for Allied airmen shot down over France. To his astonishment, he recognized one of the women, André Borel, who had been part of his network.
I started shouting in English, "Hello, are you English girls?" And all of a sudden a face appeared behind the barrels of the window of the jail. And I could see the face of a girl, and she said to me, "Yes, I'm English." And I said, "Well, why are you there?" And then the face disappeared.
The full horror of what happened next at Natzweiler was revealed to Vera Atkins by Barkworth's investigators. First, the camp's medical officer, Dr. Werner Roeder, had been seen walking towards the crematorium.
Dr. Roeder had in the crematorium a little office. The girls were taken one by one into Dr. Roeder's room, where he gave them an injection, which was supposed to be a lethal injection.
The girls were assured they were being given an injection against typhoid. But Dr. Roeder almost certainly used a dose of carbolic acid. It was the Nazi doctor's preferred killing technique. When they were believed to be dead, the 4 women were taken to the crematorium where the camp executioner, Peter Straub, was waiting to burn their bodies. The other prisoners saw the telltale signs of a cremation.
A gust of flame bursting out of the chimney of the crematorium, which meant that the door of the oven of the crematorium had been opened and shut.
It was an horrific multiple murder, but what the investigators found out next was even more grotesque.
One of the women, on being pushed into the furnace, regained consciousness. And at that instance, she clawed Straub down one side of his face. And he still had the marks of that woman's fingernails.
The brutal executioner, Peter Straub, the man in charge of the crematorium was now top of Barkworth's hit list. The Nazi hunters scoured Germany looking for their man, finally tracking him down to an address in Mannheim.
We went upstairs, banged on the door. A young lady came and answered the door. And Peter Straub was sat on the sofa in the little small living room smoking a cigar. And on seeing that the scar still existed on his face, we then decided to arrest Straub and put him back in prison, which we did, and he was then normally charged with the rest of them for war crimes.
The camp doctor, Werner Roeder, who had given the lethal injections, was also quickly tracked down. By early 1946, Barkworth's investigators had made scores of arrests across occupied Germany. They did their job well. Dr. Isselhorst, the commander of the vicious manhunt against the SAS, and many of the killers in his Gestapo death squads, were now in custody. Only Dr. Ernst was missing. The scene was now set for the Nazi hunters to seek justice for their murdered comrades. At the SAS war crimes trial in Germany in May 1946, the Nazi suspects had one basic defense. They were obeying Hitler's infamous wartime order, declaring that all enemy soldiers operating behind the lines should be shot without mercy. The defendants claimed the SAS, who had been caught with sabotage equipment and explosives, were therefore legally killed as spies. In reply, the prosecution successfully argued the men had been murdered in blatant disregard for the rules of war laid down in the Geneva Convention. They pointed out, legal executions do not take place secretly in woods, with clothing, valuables, and identity removed. At the end of the trial, Dr. Isselhorst, who had authorized the execution of many of the SAS men, was condemned and handed over to the French, who had him shot. Most of his subordinates were either imprisoned or sentenced to death, including Heinrich Neuschwanger, who had personally murdered 5 SAS men. The Nazis who had murdered Vera Atkins' girls at Natzweiler were also in the dock. Dr. Roeder, who'd administered the injections, was hanged. Peter Straub, the man who burnt one agent alive, was given a more lenient sentence, but eventually hanged for another offense. In the end, one man on Barkworth's list of suspects was still missing. Dr. Ernst, the Gestapo leader who had executed his SAS captives and terrorized the people of Musset. In 1977, a letter arrived for the mayor of Musset from one of France's greatest Nazi hunters, Serge Klaasveld. He and his wife Beate had tracked down the infamous Dr. Ernst, working as a lawyer in Lower Saxony. They'd already had him barred from the legal profession, and they were hoping soon to bring him to trial. But Ernst never faced his accusers in court. He died the following year, falling downstairs. It was the closing of a bitter chapter both for his French victims and for the SAS. By then, Barkworth's Nazi hunters were long gone, but his murdered comrades who lay buried in the village would have been proud of his grim determination to achieve justice in their name.